Today, we're going to be talking about asset versus impact and how we can help prioritize these and how that can really change the dynamic of these types of programs that we have. So this is one of the things we've seen a lot of customers have a lot of challenges with, right? We see a lot of teams where an IT team starts coming in, they start working on a project like an OT security project, and they have a lot of issues communicating with the site folks, understanding what these devices are and what these assets are in terms of the broader scope of a plant environment or something like that. And this is really what we're talking about today, right? How can we help bridge some of these gaps between IT and OT, and how this can not only help with the language barrier, right? Making sure that our teams are communicating in the same ways, but also helping us with things like risk remediation and prioritization, which can really significantly change how our vulnerability programs work, how our criticality and risk programs work, and can really help to make sure that the work that you guys are doing in the field to help address cybersecurity risk is focused in the right area, and that we're really moving the needle against the right types of systems. So today we'll go through a bunch of different topics. I'm going to start with kind of the table stakes on where we're at with cyber physical systems today, right? Kind of what Clarity's seeing, what we've seen from our customer base, and what we view the kind of security landscape looking like. And then I'm going to get into this specific issue of the asset-centric versus impact-centric approach of viewing assets. So I'll get into a lot of detail on this of kind of why we're doing this and the challenges we're trying to face. But the broad idea here is that instead of just identifying assets by an asset ID or an IP address or something like that, we want to really identify what that device is doing in the broader context of your environment. So again, instead of just a random PLC at 192.168.1.42, it is going to be a controller that is part of production line 1 at your plant in Chicago, right? Something that your plant folks understand, they know what this thing is, and they know what it's doing. Then I'll go into exactly how Clarity is doing this and some of the things that we've done to try and help this. So that's broadly what we're going to go through, but let's go ahead and dive right in. So if we look at cyber physical systems today, like why are we even talking about this, right? Why are we even talking about risk change and OT systems and industrial environments and that sort of thing? I think we've seen a lot of changes over the years that have really forced us to start embracing security in the industrial and cyber physical system space a lot different. First is expanded connectivity. I'm sure this is something a lot of you have seen, but this idea of air gap systems that we used to have a lot of in the past has dramatically changed. Whether it's new systems that require more and more connectivity, third-party vendors that require access to the systems for either maintenance activities or maintaining a warranty or something like that, or metrics that your business is trying to get out of your OT environments, things like production data and those type of things. There's just more and more connectivity that's continuing to happen on these operational networks. It's also something that I think is going to continue accelerating, right? We have a lot of systems doing this today, but it's something that I think we're going to continue seeing as we move forward. Another big area is that we're seeing more and more threats, right? I'm sure this is something you guys also see as well. We see more and more attacks as the surface changes, as the target of these industrial and CPS networks continues to expand because we're continuing to connect them more and more. We're seeing more and more accessibility from an attacker point of view. And this is, I think, a lot of why we have now C-suites and board levels more and more often absorbing that and understanding that there is real risk to these networks and that we need to do something to actually address that risk. The last item here is regulatory pressure. You know, we see this a lot across a variety of different industries. Any of you folks that are in like the midstream oil and gas industry or anything like that probably are aware that the TSA came on as a new regulator after the events of Colonial Pipeline a couple of years ago. We see things like NERC and FERC in the US. In the European Union, the NIS2 requirements have changed dramatically, the cybersecurity requirements for critical infrastructure. So all of these things are all things that change how we view these types of networks and require some sort of response, right? We have to start doing something to be able to start securing these networks and make sure that we're driving effective change and reducing the risk to these cyber physical systems. So from that, on the attack point of view, this is also something that not only we're seeing more of these, again, you can just see that if you go look at the front page of the New York Times, but it's also having more of an impact on actual customers. So this is from a report that Clarity does every year on the state of cyber physical system security. And from our research, we found that 67% of these types of attacks incurred at least $100,000 or more of financial impact. So whether it's lost production or sites going down or things like that, there's real financial stakes to these. We also see 45% of organizations have stated that at least half of their CPS systems are connected to the network. So again, this idea of air-gapped systems, I think, is more and more going the way of the dodo, right? It's not something that we have in these environments. They're getting connected at an ever-increasing rate. On the other side, we also have 49% of organizations that are experiencing at least 12 hours of downtime due to some sort of cyber attack, and 82% of these organizations experience at least one cyber attack that came from a remote access source. So again, things are getting more and more connected. The impact of these attacks are increasing. It's causing more downtime, more financial loss, and things like third-party remote access and these sort of things are causing this to increase and change over time. This is also something that we need a unique approach, right? I'm sure this is something a lot of you guys have talked about, but this is one of the reasons why Clarity exists in this space is because we have this unique OT view, right? In the IT space, we have different systems. It's much more servers, laptop switches. While in the OT environment, we have specific systems that are focused in this areas. Things like PLCs, RTUs, pumps, motors, drives, right? Systems that are specific to OT environments. Also, the focus on what we're protecting is very different. In the IT environment, things like confidentiality and integrity are very, very high. When we're dealing with things like financial data or personal information, we have to make sure that the confidentiality of that stays very, very high. On the OT environments, it really flips, right? We're much more focused on availability, and things like safety and reliability trump everything else. We need to have safe operations, and we need to make sure that the operation stays available. So it really shifts the conversation from a security point of view. Also, protocols are very different. On the IT side, everything's pretty standardized. We have also very standard device types. On the OT side, there's a very wide and diverse types of assets that we see across customers and a lot of different proprietary protocols that makes traditional security solutions challenging to implement. This continues along when we talk about controls. Again, on the IT side, everybody can kind of, if you're going and implementing an EDR, you have a handful to choose from, but it's a very defined space. On the OT side, this operational context changes how we need to do security and makes it where traditional IT tools can't necessarily be used in this space. And the final thing here shows about that compatibility, right? On the IT side, we have wide compatibility, a lot of different tools we can choose from. On the OT side, that's just not the case. We need to have something built for this environment and something that we can utilize. So this is kind of the state of play that Clarity has seen across this environment. This is also something where we see the current systems that we have in place can really fall short. Again, if we're trying to leverage IT solutions or if we're using antiquated discovery methods, you really don't have the level of detail that you need to take insights and take action against the assets that you have. This is also something to the point of this discussion. When we talk about things like asset purpose and what a device is doing in the environment, that sort of context and that level of data really makes it so we can take the appropriate actions and that we don't get kind of burdened with what we see with companies trying to put together IT solutions or point products into this space. It really leads to, segmented environments that don't have or dispersed environments that don't really have the appropriate tools in place to be able to do the actions that your board or your C-suite is really looking for. So these are the things that we've seen. Again, this is kind of the current environment that Clarity has seen, and what we see is kind of the existing state of play. So all that talks about what the existing space looks like from a security point of view. This is where we want to kind of shift into something more specific on this asset-centric view. Again, this is something we get a lot of conversations with from customers. And I think the space in OT security has really shifted a lot in this over the years. In the past, all it was about was getting an asset inventory, right? I just need a list of assets. That's where I want to start. That's what I need to get, right? I just need to know what exists in my operational environment. As we've developed and as Clarity has kind of expanded over the years, right? We're just celebrating our 10-year birthday. We've seen a lot of challenges with this approach, right? With just this approach of getting a list of assets, getting a list of IPs and MAC addresses to show what devices are. So what are some of those challenges, right? What has Clarity been seeing from our customers? So some of the challenges that we see from our customers where we're just focused on this asset-centric visibility is that you have a list of devices with no context. Again, I mentioned before, initially, all these projects were just focused on give me that list of assets. But then when you try and do your additional use cases, right? If you're trying to go respond to a threat in an OT environment, or remediate a vulnerability in one of your plant sites, and you go tell a system engineer, hey, this is a Siemens PLC at 192.168.1. whatever, they don't necessarily know what that is, right? They are not talking in IPs and MACs. They're talking in systems and functions, right? They do not know what that is. And when you call them up, you send all this data, all your alert data off to a SOC, and you call up the site folks and say, hey, this IP address is having some weird information. The electrical engineer, the mechanical engineer at site that owns this system doesn't have the context necessary to be able to respond to that. It makes it very, very challenging if we're not talking that common language. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we see with asset-centric visibility. One of the other big issues we see here is there's no clear way to prioritize exposures. Again, this is something that Clarity's focused a lot on, especially in the last few years. But when we have customers that are trying to respond to things like attack exposures, or try to identify how they can start doing remediation, typically you end up with a giant list, right? This is the challenge we hear from customers over and over and over again. You go plug in a solution like Clarity, you get a list of tens of thousands of vulnerabilities, half of them are CVSS, V9 or 10, and they are critical or high vulnerabilities that we need to go deal with. But that's just not that is not a amount of work that we can actually do in the field, right? We don't typically have the people power to go respond to this sort of stuff. We don't have the time to be able to go be patching systems, and we need to have a better way to prioritize these exposures. So this is something Clarity's already done a lot of work on with our exposure management module, but even with that, we're still seeing customers have challenges, right? We want to make sure that any work that we're doing in the plant to go remediate exposures or remediate vulnerabilities is spent in the right place, and asset-centric visibility really falls short of that. The final thing here is kind of continuing on that point of communication, that with asset-centric visibility, we don't have a clear way to communicate with the asset owner. So not only do we not have the context when we're talking to a plant person, but we don't have the ability to tell them exactly what these systems are. When you talk to, again, an electrical engineer or mechanical engineer at site, they know what the sites do, they know what they're producing, they know all the production lines. If we're talking, say like a company that's producing milk products or something like that. They know what the receiving systems look like. They know all the different production lines, all the different mixing stations that they have at the site. They know what the receiving line looks like, but they don't know what a specific IP address is in this VLAN that's doing this thing, right? That is context that your IT folks definitely know and your networking folks understand, but your site folks that are actually doing the work and need to go remediate things or change configurations at the site level, they need to have more context, and we need to be able, as security professionals, we need to be able to talk that language to these site personnel so that we can actually move the needle, make sure that we're working on the right stuff, and give that information over correctly. So again, as Clarity is coming up on our 10-year anniversary, this is something that we've been getting a lot from the field. This is something that we've had a lot of conversations with customers about. And the conversation always goes the same, where they want a better way to do this, right? We need to get away from just this list of IP addresses and MAC addresses and bring something new to the table so that we can better communicate with our plants, better prioritize work that we're doing, and start bringing that critical context to everything that we're doing within the environment. So this is the problem. What are we actually doing to try and fix it? This is where we've started up with an idea of what we call impact-centric approach. Instead of just having device-centric, where we're looking at, again, random devices, random vulnerabilities against a random Siemens PLC at some, or a Rockwell PLC at some IP and MAC address, we want to start focusing on what these devices are doing within the plant, right? Instead of just being a random Siemens PLC, this is a PLC that's part of some critical safety system that, if it fails, could lead to, a safety impact within the facility, versus this is a different random Siemens PLC that's associated with a backup system that is not critical if it fails, right? Maybe you can have very, very different impacts depending on what that specific device is doing. So how do we actually view this? We want to change away and move away from this idea of device identity. So this is that idea, again, of just a random PLC, a random conveyor line, a random pump within your facility, and move to the greater purpose that device has within the plant environment. So again, some random Siemens PLC or random Rockwell PLC within your plant is part of a bigger system. It's part of a packaging line. It's part of a safety system. It's part of your receiving area, right? And understanding that purpose allows us to do a lot of really interesting things when we're talking about prioritizing remediation, prioritizing risk and criticality for devices, because we actually can understand the business purpose of one of these devices. Again, this also goes for things like switches, things like engineering workstations, HMIs. All of these devices are all part of some broader context within your site. And being able to bring that purpose to bear really can help us prioritize and tackle some of these challenges that we've been seeing customers have. Again, things like where they don't have the context to be able to prioritize things, where they aren't able to communicate between your sites and your IT folks. Understanding that device purpose allows us to do this. So when we start doing that, when we have that additional context, what does this allow us to do, right? If I have a switch or an HMI, and instead of, again, just having a random IP and MAC address, I understand that this switch is part of this mixing station, line 1. And this switch is part of this, our palletizing system in our shipping area. And this switch is part of our refrigeration units in our receiving area, right? All of those are very different. And from that, I can start building out broader context across my environment. So from that, I can do things like visualize connectivity. We get a lot of requests from customers on they want to understand how their systems communicate within a site. Not just that, again, devices are communicating, but how does this production line communicate with this other production line? Or how do my sites communicate, right? Instead of just looking at a group of assets, how do my different production lines or my different safety systems or these different things within my environment, how are they communicating? And being able to bring that up visually can make it very easy to see if I have abnormal communications. a lot of times we see things like you may have a dependency on different systems in your environment that you don't even know is there until you get this level of visualization to see that, hey, this production line is talking to my palletizer over here, which it shouldn't be, right? I shouldn't have any communication between those lines. And this lets us identify those and quickly go remediate that. The other thing here that I think is the most critical is asset criticality, right? When we talk about responding and prioritizing things like exposures, being able to bring in business impact dramatically changes the game. Because again, you have the same type of devices within your environment that are doing drastically different functions. The exact same model and firmware version of a PLC may be used in some critical safety system where if it fails could lead to a release that gets you a regulatory action, may even lead to damage to health and safety of the public. Like it could have serious ramifications in one instance, where in another instance, that exact same type, model, firmware of PLC is used in some random backup system that is just not critical and it can fail and it's not a big deal, right? So having that business context allows us to change the criticality. And again, when we're talking about things like remediation or prioritizing response effort, we really want to focus on that safety system first, because that is so much more critical to our business. This impact-centric view gives us that context and allows us to start responding to that. Other things here that are very critical are things like zones. If we're using this idea to be able to respond and build out things like an IEC 62443 zones and conduit analysis, if we're trying to do segmentation, being able to segment by system and by purpose is generally much more effective when we're looking at a micro-segmentation point of view. So being able to do this becomes very critical when we're trying to put in more advanced networking controls. The last thing here is on reporting, and I think a lot of this goes down to things like regulatory reporting. We have a lot of customers that are more and more often being required to do regulatory reports on assets, and being able to have that context that not only is this asset part of a system, but it's also in scope for things like the TSA regulations or NERC-CIP regulations, right? Being able to define those assets as being in scope brings an additional layer of context in and allows us to make much more informed decisions when we're actually responding to things within the field. So what does this look like in action? So again, I keep talking about, random PLCs at IPs and Macs. Here's a really great example. So this is a Rockwell ControlLogix 5580. It's running a specific firmware version of 35.12. It has these rack slots installed. And if I'm looking at these two devices, which is kind of how your traditional asset inventory system looks at it, what's the difference here, right? These are the same things. Like maybe they'll have a different IP address. They'll have different IP addresses. They may even have the same IP address, right? They may have the same private IP addresses because of how your plant implements it. How do I know which one of these I need to remediate first? Well, this is where most vendors stop, right? They stop at this level. They give you that information, which is good. It's definitely good to have, but it doesn't give you the context to take the next step. This is where if we bring in device purpose, I can pull in that extra information. So again, this device on the left, even though it looks identical to this device on the right, this device on the left is part of my raw materials receiving. And while the device on the left is part of some batch processing system where it's line 50 out of 75, right? So this item on the left is part of a single point of failure that is critical to my business, that is something where if it fails, if my receiving line goes down in my factory, no product is coming in, which means all my downstream impacts get impacted and my factory basically shuts down. So this is obviously highly critical. It's very important that I go resolve something on these types of systems first, because these are my most critical systems, right? If I lose that receiving, I lose everything downstream of it. Whereas this device on the right is part of a batch processing system where I have tons of redundancy. I have many lines here. And if any single line is to fail, it does not shut my factory down, right? I can continue operating on the other lines. I regularly take these out for maintenance. This is something that the failure condition for these two devices are dramatically different. If my device on the left fails, I shut my plant down. If the device on the right fails, I continue operating. This is critical context when I'm talking remediation or trying to secure these assets, right? This asset on my left is crown jewel type territory. And because I have this device purpose now, it allows me to get the context and understand that this is one of my crown jewel assets and that I need to go remediate it first before I go target that same type of PLC, that same model of PLC that's in a much less critical system. So this is just one example, but hopefully you can see having this context allows us to make much more informed decisions and be able to do this with a lot more context in our plant environments. So that's just one example, but let's kind of look at how Clarity's done it. So again, this is something that we've been seeing from a lot of our customers. We've gotten this, again, I keep bringing up the birthday, but we've been in this game for a long time. And we've seen these challenges across our customers over the last 10 years, where they're not able to make the right context-sensitive decision-making because they don't have all the data that they need to be able to understand what these devices are doing within their field. So Clarity has started building out this device purpose function within its systems. And this is something that is very, very new. We just released it a few months back. And it's been something that we're really starting to see major benefits from our customers on, right? We just implemented this function. Customers can now start getting this context into their system so they can understand what function these devices are doing. And again, this is something we've started to already see a lot of benefit from our customer base on. So why are we doing this? Well, this is something that we want to start reflecting the actual operation of a customer's environment and moving into this more impact-centric view of securing these operations. So what does it get us as we start implementing it? Well, first thing is we get improved risk reduction, right? When we can start deciding on risk reduction based on criticality, we can actually prioritize our most critical assets first, which moves the needle from a risk reduction point of view much, much more. Again, if I'm talking about reducing a risk to a single point of failure or a safety system within my site versus something that has many, many levels of redundancy and doesn't have a critical impact if it fails, those are very, very different in terms of business risk and business impact. And it allows me to target those areas that are much more important and do risk assessments that are based in our real world consequence, right? Really understanding what the business impact of these changes are. The other thing is incident response. Having that context makes your incident response dramatically faster. Again, I cannot tell you the number of times that I've had a OT SOC, call out to a site and tell them, hey, we need to do a response on this PLC at this IP address. And the site doesn't know what that is, right? They don't know what, they can't tell you off the top of their head what a random PLC at a random IP address is. But they can tell you what PLC is. If you say it's the Siemens PLC that is associated with your receiving area, right? They know what that is. They understand that, and it allows you to talk in the same language and dramatically reduces your response time, your root cause analysis, and ultimately your downtime, right? You can speed this up because you actually understand what these devices are, and it can much more quickly have response in the field. The other thing here is your collaboration, right? This breaks down one of the biggest communication barriers I see between IT and OT folks. Once we start talking about what your plants are doing, that's something that is business context that the people in your company understand. They know that this site in Chicago makes these types of widgets, where this site in Atlanta makes these other ones, and they understand the types of systems you have at that site. So it really, really helps break down those barriers. And from a project point of view, especially if you have an IT project that's kind of tasked with OT security, this type of context brings a huge amount of collaboration between your IT and your OT teams because you get that common view. This also allows you, if you're forced to do compliance reporting or anything like that, this is a big piece of that. We always need to identify critical assets and critical systems, and this lets us do that with this purpose of these devices. What does it actually look like in practice? So Clarity's, again, been implementing this for the past couple of months, and it allows us to create a hierarchical view of what these assets are doing. So things like, is this part of some global system, right? Is it part of, if it's a auto manufacturing facility, right? Is it part of your auto manufacturing lines or your engine lines, or different things that may have different global business units and different functions? Then we may go into a regional level, right? This is my North America view as opposed to my European sites or my Latin America sites or things like that. Then I get down to the actual site level. So this is part of my global auto manufacturing. It's in North America and it's at Detroit, right? I know it's at the site one in Detroit. Then I start getting into actual functional levels, right? Is it part of one of my paint shops at my site, or is it part of my final assembly at site, right? Is it the thing that's actually painting the vehicles, or is it something that's actually the final assembly area for that? Then we can continue going deeper, right? In my paint shop, is it part of primer, or is it part of one of my other systems? If it's in my final assembly, is it part of my chassis line, or is it part of my glass installation line? And then you can even go a layer deeper where we're saying whether it's things like electrocoat dip, our wheel mounting, our windshield cell, right? We can go all the way down to these deep levels. And this is a group of assets, right? This single primer line or the single electrocoat dip system is a group of assets within this facility. And having that context allows us to very quickly understand what these devices are and what they're doing. So again, if I'm called up in the middle of the night, my SOC has an incident and I need to go respond to it, being able to call up this plant and say, hey, guys in Detroit, this is part of the wheel mounting line one in your chassis line and final assembly in Detroit, right? They know exactly what that is. They know what that line is. They know where it's at in the plant. They know what those devices are, and they can quickly get there and respond. Whereas if we're talking some IP address at some random IP address, then you have to go through this entire process to try and figure out what that IP is, figure out what switch it's off of, and kind of chase it down within the facility. So it not only lets us talk that same language, but it gives us that context. So if we are responding to an incident, or we are trying to prioritize criticality, I get that information and I get that level of detail for what these devices are actually doing within the plant. So I've gone ahead and built that up. What else are we going to do with it? So one of the first things that we normally suggest customers do, is we set this up and then we start setting up business impact. Again, this is something that can get you some immediate benefits here, because I now know the business context for these systems and how this impacts my overall corporate structure, right? Again, certain systems at sites are just more critical than others. It's true all over the place. You may have safety systems, you may have regulatory systems, you may have single points of failure, where we need to be able to reflect the criticality of those. So within Clarity, not only can I define all these systems, but then as you can see here in this little image here, I can actually increase the risk and the business impact of these systems, which will mean all of those assets will immediately become more critical. And when I am doing remediation or response, I immediately get the benefit of that. And I get this transformation of where, instead of just looking at random assets, I am now looking at the business impact of these assets and responding appropriately. This also lets me start prioritizing my business impact. Again, if we look at an organization with hundreds of thousands of assets, they may have 10,000 assets that are part of critical processes. Out of those, 1,200 of those may have known exploited vulnerabilities, so things we want to go do something with. Maybe a bunch of assets have ransomware links. This is pretty normal for large-scale customers where you have a big old pile of work, right? We have a lot of different things here. But once I get this business impact, I can narrow this list of maybe 10,000 different assets that I should be working on down to 40 business critical devices that have these known exploited vulnerabilities, that maybe have a link to a ransomware or insecure internet connectivity. And these are things that not only are highly critical from a risk perspective, but highly critical from a business perspective as well. So not only am I taking, very good action because I'm focusing on these highly critical situations and these highly exposed assets, but I know that the work that I'm doing is having the most business impact because I'm focusing on these areas of the plant that have the highest impact to my bottom line. And it allows us to, again, move the needle much, much more dramatically when I'm taking these actions. So that's broadly what we're doing. I always get told by marketing I have to give the whole pitch too. So this is something new that we're doing, again, with asset impact, but Clarity is doing a lot of different things as well. We bring in things like visibility and insights. We also do exposure management to help prioritize and remediate devices. Things like device purpose help us feed into this to make sure that we are getting the right responses when we're looking at exposures or risk remediation. We also have a whole section around network protection that's all focused on things like putting in microsegmentation or more restrictive firewall rules or things like that to actually be able to start applying segmentation controls. We also have a whole process that's specifically built around secure remote access. So we have our Exome Secure Access line that is built around allowing third-party remote access into plant environments. And we have a full line of threat detection, right? Real-time threat detection. It's curated not only for real-time threat detection, but new threat intelligence. We bring all that in. It's all powered by our Team 82 research team that pulls this data in to be able to give you the context, not only for an ongoing threat, but also against other potential threats through our threat intelligence feeds. So this is broadly what we're doing as Clarity. The last thing I'll quickly throw in here is, again, we just went through this Gartner process for Magic Quadrant. This is something that we're very, very proud of. Clarity has been named a leader in this space. You can also see in this, we're actually all the way in the top right. So we're very, very proud of our positioning here. So this is something that we continue to innovate on, things like device purpose, to make sure that we can execute our vision, make sure that our customers can get all the context and the information that they need so that they can appropriately respond. Again, this is also something we're proud of from our customer base. Clarity is recommended by 96% of our customers in Gartner on our Gartner Peer Insights. So this is something we're constantly trying to push the envelope on to make sure that we can maintain this leader position and continue to innovate on things like we've been talking about today with more context-sensitive information for devices, moving away from this traditional method of asset-centric risk remediation. So I've talked through a lot of stuff here. I think I've left a couple of minutes here for questions as I've gone through this. Hopefully it was interesting. I think Aaron was going to hop back in here and see if we got any questions to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Gary. It was incredibly informative. A few questions that we've received. First, are customers currently using this more for criticality or for risk evaluations?
Yeah, it's actually a little bit of both. So again, this is something we've been doing for a couple of months now, and we've had a lot of really good feedback from customers as we're starting to implement it. I think it depends on where in the journey customers are, on which side of that they're doing. A lot of them just start with that criticality, right, which gets you a lot of benefit just out of the gate, right? Just by defining criticality and adding that business impact can help with a lot of the decision-making process, whether it's risk, criticality, whether it's threat detection, whatever we're doing. So that's where we see a lot of customers start. But a lot of them are starting to use it for risk evaluations, right? They're starting to apply this as another metric so that when they are taking action to go do remediation, they have this as a primary context point so that they can make sure they're taking the right action and really reducing risk the most in their environment to their most critical systems.
Fantastic. How can this be used in a regulated environment? Does it introduce anything challenging?
Yeah, so this is something that we also see a lot of customers. Actually, one of the reasons we built this is we were seeing customers kind of starting to do this on their own as they were getting regulated through things like asset tags and things like that. So I think for regulated customers in particular, this is very top of mind. Regardless of what regulation you're subject to, almost all of them require you to identify and define critical assets and have a higher level of monitoring for all of those. So device purpose is a great way of doing that, right? I can create a special category for my, whether it's NERC SIP, protected assets, or the new TSA requirements for critical assets, right? I define those. It allows me to track those better, report against those better over time. So I think for regulated customers in general, this really helps with that. And from whether it's reporting or identification, this can really help identify those and make sure that we're able to generate those reports correctly.
Yeah, it seems ideal to set that up and be prepared for those evaluations and conversations.
Yeah.
Lastly, the last one we've got here, how are we actually populating this data into the system?
Yeah, so we're pulling this from a bunch of different sources currently. So this is very sensitive to your environment, right? The unique part about device purpose is this is your business context. So this is something unique to your environment. So we're usually trying to pull in additional data sources, like we're looking at data in things like ServiceNow or in Rockwell Asset Center, or obviously Version Dog, right? There's a lot of different points where we can look at existing places that may be tagging system level data or purpose level data. We use that to populate data into the system in a number of different ways. In some customers, they're just doing it based on things like VLANs or subnets or things like that. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do it. It really depends on the customer environment. But again, it's something that as we get this populated, customers are really immediately seeing the change. If it's just in their conversations, if it's in their incident response, their risk remediation, right? I really like to kind of call this as like the new functional building block of clarity, right? Like this context really gives that, moving away from IPs and Macs and moving towards this is in this system or this is part of this process really changes the way that you interact with a system like Clarity. And we've seen these huge benefits as customers are starting to embrace it.
Amazing. It is definitely one of my favorite features and applications of understanding and bridging this language gap in our customer base. Thank you again, Gary. Thank you everyone for joining us and for your time today. I mentioned at the very beginning, but anyone who registered today will receive the recording after in just a few hours. We thank you again. See you next time.